Welcome to the final week of the spring 2021 semester as we do a rapid-fire wrap-up of America in the early post-war decades, 1950s and 1960s America. In our most recent lecture, we discussed the Cold War and the onset of the Cold War and the geographical battle lines that were drawn for what turned out to be a largely ideological war as opposed to a military war. We discussed that at length in our most recent lecture. We're going to continue with the Cold War theme into the 1950s and take a look at how it impacted American life, day-to-day American life, with regard to Joseph McCarthy and McCarthy's accusations of communist influence and the dangers of Communist Party members in America, and how for a few years that turned into a political nightmare for many Americans. And then we will move on from there to discuss how McCarthyism came crashing down toward the late 1950s, or mid to late 1950s, I should say. But we'll also take a look at the legacy of McCarthyism and which politicians used the same tactics or similar tactics to their own political advantage in the decades that followed the 1950s. So let us begin today by taking a look at McCarthyism and just what that meant. What was that all about exactly? Well, as I mentioned in the most recent lecture about the Cold War, it was basically an ideological split between America and the Soviet Union, the two global superpowers that were left standing, if you will, or intact, if you will, at the end of World War II. And they had very, very different ideas and philosophies in terms of their economic system and in terms of politics and government and the way that their respective countries operated. America adhered to a sort of free market capitalism from an economic standpoint, a democratically elected government with the President of the United States and the Vice President, as well as individual members of Congress, governors, and other local officials when you got down to the state and regional level. Whereas, by contrast, the Soviet Union utilized a communist economic system and a totalitarian government regime where one individual, in this case Joseph Stalin in the late 1940s, early 1950s, had total control over the government and over the people of the Soviet Union during that time. As I mentioned the other day, that most of the Eastern countries in Europe, the countries that were geographically in Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, East Germany, those were all countries that were Soviet-backed and sort of followed the Soviet model of a communist regime, a totalitarian government, if you will, whereas the Western European nations, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, etc., those countries were following the democratic example, the democratically elected system of government, as where the people choose the leaders, just like the United States, and they believed in a economic system that was similar to the capitalism that was employed in the United States. So that's basically the backdrop for the Cold War beginning in the early 1950s. And Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican United States Senator from Wisconsin, saw an opportunity for himself to gain fame and notoriety politically, perhaps had visions of higher office, running for the White House, maybe in the mid-1950s or late 1950s. But first and foremost, he was trying to gain a name for himself, so he used the deep distrust that existed in America at the time, at the outset of the 1950s, to establish an atmosphere of paranoia among U.S. citizens, and he would use that atmosphere of paranoia to his advantage through the early years of the 1950s. Once again, it's important to remember that this is taking place just a few short years after the conclusion of World War II in 1945. American citizens do not really want to go to war, neither do most of the countries in Western Europe. But at the same time, there was no question that there was division across Europe with the Eastern Bloc and the Western nations and the Soviet Union and the United States during this time. And in the late 1940s, the combination of the Soviet Union developing the technology for nuclear weapons and a nuclear bomb, as well as the fall of China into communism, the triumph of Mao Zedong that we talked about in the last lecture, and his communist regime taking over in 1949, that has Americans on edge. They became extremely wary of communism and any individuals who identified as members of the Communist Party. Now, it's important to remember, too, that the Communist Party had some representation in the United States for several decades prior to this point. In the 1930s, in particular, in certain cities and certain geographic regions of the country, there was a very active Communist Party. So it wasn't as if the idea of someone belonging to the Communist Party politically was completely unheard of or unorthodox in the U.S. During the middle part of the 20th century, although certainly the Communist Party's overall membership was a very small representation of the nation as a whole. McCarthy understands that there is a tremendous amount of distrust and wariness on with regards to the American people and the way that they're feeling towards the Cold War, and especially when the United States enters into the Korean conflict and participates in the Korean War. A lot of people are on edge. You know, what happens if this escalates and breaks out into World War III? What happens if Russia uses a nuclear weapon on the United States? What happens if the U.S. decides to use a nuclear weapon on Russia? These are all things that nobody really wants to think about, but at the same time, it was unavoidable and unescapable in the minds of the American public to some degree at this time. McCarthy seizes on this fear and distrust, and he began to allege that many Communist Party members in the United States had ties to the Soviet Union or were serving or acting in some way, shape, or form as agents for the Soviets and participating in some sort of espionage program for the Soviet Union or a program of trying to convert other Americans to communism as a whole. So McCarthy begins a public campaign against communists in the early months of 1950. Right at the onset of the 1950s as a whole is when McCarthyism begins to take root in the public discourse in America. So what did McCarthyism look like, or what were the elements of McCarthyism beyond just one guy standing there and alleging that the Communist Party was growing by leaps and bounds in the United States, and you couldn't trust anybody. Well, there were actually some groups within Congress that actively investigated subversives, or the people they called quote unquote subversives, as well as people that they thought might have connections to communists. They were the House Un-American Activities Committee. That's HUAC, or HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was a committee in the United States House of Representatives. It had been formed in the 1930s, so it had been around for a while, but it really kind of became even more active in the late 1940s and the early to mid 1950s during McCarthyism and what's known as the Red Scare. That's another term for McCarthyism, the Red Scare, because Communist Party identified with the red flag of the Soviet Union. So communists were referred to as Reds, if you will. So the Red Scare was another way to describe McCarthyism in the U.S. The main objective of HUAC and its counterpart committee in the Senate, the SPSI, was to investigate specific individuals and industries who they feared might have influential communist party members, or who might, as a whole, use communism to influence the American public and try to persuade the American public. So what industries, you ask, would that be? Frankly, the entertainment industry jumped right out as a high-profile industry. Hollywood and the film industry were frequently investigated by HUAC. It's the 1940s and early 1950s. Television is not quite yet a staple in American households the way it would become by the end of the decade in the 1950s. Only about 10% of Americans' homes contained a television set in 1950, as opposed to roughly 80% or more of the American households by 1960 had at least one television set. So that means the main form of entertainment beyond listening to the radio would be going to the movies. We've talked about the growth and development of motion pictures and movies in America from the mid-19-teens through the 1920s and into the 30s. By the middle part of the 20th century, in the 1940s and 1950s, movies are extremely popular forms of entertainment, both because there were interesting, exciting stories acted out by attractive actors and actresses that people wanted to see, and also it represented an evening out, an outing, if you will, for you and your date, your spouse, your significant other, or you and your group of friends, or you and your family members. It was an event going to the movies and taking in a movie in, say, 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951. It was an event that you kind of circled on your weekly calendar, if you will, and when you had the opportunity to go see a film. And so, as you might imagine, popular films were quite influential in the culture as a whole in America. Pop culture was sort of dominated by Hollywood movies during this time, and the biggest biggest actors became the biggest celebrities in America during this time period. So, HUAC regularly investigated the film industry, the entertainment industry. Numerous writers, producers, and directors wound up being blacklisted because they quite simply refused to answer questions from HUAC representatives, or they were often blacklisted with very thin evidence if they had even been named as a communist by other individuals within the entertainment industry. And what it boils down to, if you want to just put it simply, McCarthyism gave HUAC the ability to actively conduct political witch hunts. And they did it with the film industry, they did it in the entertainment industry, they did it in other industries as well. The comic book industry, for example, in the mid-50s was another area where the House Un-American Activities Committee significantly investigated to try to find some evidence of communist influence or infiltration, or trying to persuade the youth of America to subversive ideas. But HUAC also used the atmosphere of fear during this time to discredit any individuals whose personal political beliefs they disagreed with. One very high-profile example of this was Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was an actor and entertainer who had previously been a standout athlete decades earlier. He was a black man, an African-American man in the middle part of the 20th century. He was also a guy who was, frankly, an activist. He was outspoken. He was promoting civil rights and social justice, and challenging the status quo, especially with regard to Black America and Black American men in the 1930s and 1940s. As you might imagine, the House Un-American Activities Committee, consisting almost entirely of white male congressmen, many of whom were conservative or at least leaning conservative in their cultural beliefs and values, as well as political beliefs. They might find someone like, and they did find someone like Paul Robeson to be a potentially dangerous individual with regard to how much he could influence the American public as a whole, particularly in Black America, in the neighborhoods and communities where Black Americans lived. Robeson also was outspoken against colonialism abroad, and had even been quoted in a wire service story, I believe it was an Associated Press story, in which he spoke about the fact that African American men should not serve in the U.S. military and fight the Germans and the Nazis, because at the end of the day, the Nazis weren't any better than white Americans that controlled politics, economics, and social life in America. That, in other words, as we talked about the Double V campaign in our World War II unit, where Black American leaders and journalists instructed African Americans to volunteer for the war, to fight in the war, to take any means necessary to serve the country during the war and display their patriotism. Robeson, according to this AP story, had been quoted as saying that America was not going to treat the African American community with respect and with basic dignity and human rights, so that in some way, shape, or form, it was the same, they were just as guilty as the Nazis. Now, as far as Robeson was concerned, he never said that. He claimed that he had been misquoted. The historical record does not indicate one way or the other, but it's very easy to see that during this era of mistrust and wariness, and that an organization like HUAC, given a wide berth, would be able to do whatever it could as far as an investigation to try to tie Paul Robeson into communism and the Red Scare, and try to discredit him from that angle. And if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is a picture of Jackie Robinson, the baseball star who broke the color barrier, becoming the first African-American to play Major League Baseball in 1947. This picture is of Robinson in 1949, and he is, as you can see, dressed in a crisp suit, and seated at a table in front of some microphones, and he is about to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He had been called in and asked to testify, and he kind of knew that he was being asked to testify regarding Paul Robeson and Paul Robeson's comments. Robeson was an acquaintance and a friend, but not somebody that he regularly associated with as far as activism at that time while he was busy playing baseball. But nonetheless, the House Un-American Activities Committee representatives thought that by having Robinson testify before their committee, they could ask him directly about Robeson, and if he was willing to distance himself from Robeson or in any way, shape, or form discredit Robeson, that it might go a long way in influencing other black Americans as well as white Americans, because Robinson, due to his skill, was a popular player in certain cities and regions of the country by white folks who were baseball fans as well. So they were sort of looking for that public denouncement of Paul Robeson to come from the lips of Jackie Robinson in this hearing. Robinson stopped short of doing that. He basically indicated that he could not be sure one way or the other that Robeson had said that, and that if he had said what he was quoted or what they accused him of saying with regard to the comment about Nazi Germany and the U.S. Government being one and the same in terms of their treatment toward African Americans and people of color, Robinson said that would be wrong and a misstatement and something that would be worthy of denouncing. However, he had no concrete proof that would actually happen, so he stopped short of the full denouncement that the HUAC members were hoping that he would express during their committee hearing in 1949. So it's an interesting part of American history and African American history, taking two of the more notable and influential figures in African American culture in the middle part of the 20th century and trying to pit one against the other under the guise of a government investigation and a government hearing. So that's sort of what was going on in America during this time with the House Un-American Activities Committee, which, as I mentioned, had started in the 1930s, but really became very active and very public with its investigations during the Red Scare era of McCarthyism in the early 1950s. One of the other things that you notice if you take a look at the history of this era in America is a renewed religiosity. What does that mean exactly? Well, quite simply, Americans became more outwardly religious, and religious symbols became intertwined with the symbols of politics and the American government to a degree in which they had never been linked prior to the 1950s. McCarthy, along with several prominent religious leaders such as Billy Graham, depicted communism as one of the traits of godlessness. If you were an individual who was an atheist or did not believe in God, then it would stand to reason that you would likely be a communist, or you were more likely to be a communist than someone who believed in democracy and capitalism. In fact, Billy Graham, who was one of the most prominent and successful Southern preachers of the day who really had a national following and would cultivate a national following in the decades that followed the early 1950s. Graham actually asserted that communism intended to, quote, destroy the American home and cause moral deterioration. Just not very shy about basically saying that communism would wreck the lives of the traditional American family and traditional American citizens. As a result, church attendance in America soared during this time period of the early 1950s to rates that it had never been at prior to the 1950s, and politicians began to insert religious sentiment, and specifically Christian sentiment, into government symbols. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One is concerning the Pledge of Allegiance of the United States. The Pledge of Allegiance was first written and first published in the 1890s in a juvenile magazine, and it had become popular by the mid-1920s, and the U.S. government officially recognized the Pledge of Allegiance during the Roosevelt era in the early 1940s. But until the mid-1950s, the phrase "one nation under God," which, as I'm sure you're all aware of, is part of the Pledge of Allegiance, that particular phrase, that verbiage, was not part of the pledge until 1954, when it was officially added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So all of a sudden, a pledge that was just simply a pledge to the flag and to American patriotism as a whole, but without any overt religious or Christian sentiment attached to it at all, now all of a sudden becomes very clearly a reinforcement of a Christian belief, a Christian value system, and linking that with the values of America and the values of being a loyal American and a patriotic American. That was what emerged during this period in the 1950s with the phrase "one nation under God." Also, the establishment of the phrase "in God we trust" as America's official motto. That did not occur until 1956, again, during this same era of renewed religiosity. And the argument here, as I mentioned with Billy Graham, framing communism as godlessness, but they were also, by default, framing patriotism as Christian and linking Christianity with patriotism during this time period. And to a degree, we still see elements of that in politics today. If you'll think back to last summer and the debate over changing the Mississippi state flag from the flag that contained the Confederate battle flag emblem in the upper left-hand corner to the current flag. Ultimately, obviously, the flag was changed, and it was changed not a moment too soon, as going forward in the 21st century, to a more inclusive image for all Mississippians. But if you remember, when they made the decision, the state government made the decision to change the flag, they solicited designs, submissions for a potential new flag design, and they required that every submission contain the phrase "in God we trust." And if you examine any of the Mississippi state flags that fly over government buildings today, or if you have a version of the new Mississippi state flag, or take a look at one in a photo, you can see quite clearly that the phrase "in God we trust" is on the flag. That wasn't a thing before the 1950s, before the mid-1950s, and this identification of Christianity with patriotism in America during that era. Another example of this that we see during this time frame is the monuments for the Ten Commandments, monuments that depict the Ten Commandments written out that were erected in county courthouses and city hall buildings across the U.S., and particularly across the South. Most of those are built and installed during the mid to late 1950s, during this era of renewed religiosity in America. So that's another cultural and social change that occurs during the 1950s. Americans become more outwardly religious, more outwardly Christian. They also, by the way, become more accepting, at least on the surface, of Catholics and Jewish Americans. The phrase Judeo-Christianity really becomes popular during this time, with the idea that while there were clear, distinct differences between the Protestant Christian denominations and Catholicism, and between Christianity and Judaism, that overall there were some basic tenets that all three of these religious faiths contained, such as a belief in God, belief that God was a supreme being, and things of that nature, which American political and religious leaders argued was absent in Soviet Russia and the Communist Party led over there by Joseph Stalin. So, I mentioned the McCarthyism's rise. We've talked a lot about how McCarthyism and the Red Scare originated and grew and became something that dominated quite a large sector of American political and cultural life during the early to mid 1950s. But what I find interesting about McCarthyism and Joseph McCarthy in general is that just as fast as McCarthy attracted attention and got people to believe his claims, which were not supported by any evidence whatsoever, he sort of fell back to earth in terms of people losing faith in him and ultimately turning away from him. But how did that happen exactly? What's the timeline for that happening? Well, first, in 1952, there was a presidential election. Harry Truman was not seeking re-election in 1952. He had won his own four-year term in 1948 after serving most of FDR's fourth term after FDR died in office in the spring of 1945. Truman had won in 1948 and served a full four-year term and decided not to run again in 1952, meaning it was an open race for the White House. And Dwight Eisenhower, the popular general from World War II and D-Day, he won the presidency as the Republican nominee, and he defeated Adlai Stevenson in the general election. So the Republicans gained control of the White House, and also the Republican Party won control of the U.S. Senate in the 1952 election cycle, which means that individual Republican senators become chairman of Senate committees. Joseph McCarthy becomes chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, also known as the SPSI, which I referred to earlier in our lecture as sort of the Senate counterpart to HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. McCarthy sort of takes over as the chairman of SPSI in early 1953, and once in that role, McCarthy began denouncing the U.S. military, and he specifically winds up making quite a few accusations against the Army, saying that there was widespread communist and subversive activity promoted by leftists in the Army. And this resulted in some hearings that took place in the spring of 1954. These hearings were nationally televised and occurred over a period of a little over a month, a 36-day period in which McCarthy questioned witnesses regarding the allegations that he made, witnesses from the Army, hoping to expose the Army as a bastion of lefty communist activity, or enough lefty communist activity to warrant a substantial public backlash at that time period. Unfortunately, for McCarthy, that is, McCarthy's plan backfired. He did not have the evidence to support his outrageous accusations, and he increasingly asked questions of the witnesses in an angry and disrespectful tone, not really extending the professional courtesy and respect that most Americans believed career military officers and members of the Army deserved. Millions of Americans are watching this unfold on television. By 1954, quite a few Americans have television sets that they didn't have at the start of the decade, and so these hearings were televised every single day, and that was back in an era where there were only 3 channels on television, so there wasn't the widespread array of countless cable channels as well as broadcast networks that we have today. So if you had a TV set and you had it on, or your parents had it on and you were home, it was almost unavoidable. You couldn't get away, even if you tried, from the Army McCarthy hearings and how they played out day by day. And as the process unfolded, many Americans basically turned against McCarthy. McCarthy was also criticized by Edward R. Murrow, who was a very prominent CBS News anchor and broadcaster during this time period, and that resonated with the public as well. Months after these hearings ended, the Senate voted to officially censure McCarthy, which they did in December of 1954, and that effectively stripped him of any political power that he had left over. McCarthy drifted into alcoholism and died in 1957. Before turning age 50, he died of liver failure, or complications from liver failure in 1957. And the Red Scare began to subside a little bit. It didn't completely go away, but the initial ceasefire and eventual peace agreement that ended the Korean War, coupled with the death of Joseph Stalin and the transition of power in Russia, which had happened by the end of the 1950s, Americans weren't quite as on edge as they were at the outset of the decade with regard to the Red Scare and communism and the possibilities of nuclear war and World War III and all of these other very scary things that had been on their minds when the decade began. However, even though McCarthy failed, the tactics that he used and some of the rhetoric that he used would be used again by politicians in subsequent years. In particular, other politicians would use the word communist as a descriptive label to publicly discredit any opponents that they disagreed with and they would often use this as a smear tactic to discredit a political opponent or someone that they perceived as a political opponent without actually, arguing against them on substantive policy issues. So one example of this, to give you an idea of how this was employed during this time period, the Civil Rights Movement, which had been a fledgling movement in the 1930s and early 40s, it becomes, under a new generation of leaders, a younger generation of leaders, it becomes far more prevalent and active in the mid to late 1950s and into the 1960s. And as you probably are aware, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was sort of the preeminent leader of this activist movement, the social justice movement that was the civil rights movement in America. King first comes into prominence as a leader of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and early 1956, which ultimately resulted in the desegregation of the city buses in the city of Montgomery, Alabama. King was a very young preacher in a black church in Montgomery, Alabama during that time period. But King in the 1950s and into the 60s was labeled by opponents, both inside and outside of American government, as a communist or as somebody who sympathized with the Communist Party or was un-American, had loyalties to Red China or the Soviet Union, and wanted those types of systems to be in place in the United States. There was no substantive evidence to support those claims, but that didn't stop the opponents from trying to paint Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. into a negative light with the anti-communist or with the communist label. Two men that really used the anti-communism stance to their benefit politically in the mid to late 1950s and beyond were Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both of them Republicans. Nixon was a Republican member of Congress in the House of Representatives during the 1940s. He was a member of HUAC in the late 1940s and was very prominent in some of their hearings and investigations. That enabled him to run for and get elected to the U.S. Senate from California in 1950, and just a couple years later, when Dwight Eisenhower wins the Republican nomination for president, Nixon becomes his running mate and ultimately becomes his vice president. He would serve 2 terms as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower and then run for president in 1960, in which he narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy, but of course 8 years later he would win and become president. Nixon, throughout the 50s and into the 60s and early 70s, denounced communism and but it was that early stance on HUAC, that early anti-communist position that he became publicly identified with, that helped him vault from the House of Representatives to the Senate, and that in turn made him an attractive choice for the vice presidential nomination just a few short years later, and that made him a household name to the American people. And he was eventually able to ride that all the way to the White House in 1968 due to the prominence that being a member of HUAC and taking an anti-communist position gave him. Ronald Reagan was questioned by these congressional committees during the 1950s. Reagan was a film actor who was winding down his acting career in the 50s, but he testified about the prevalence of communists and subversives in the entertainment industry during this time period. He would use the testimony that he gave and sort of his public stance against communism as a means to effectively court conservative voters when he ran for governor of California in 1966. Reagan won that election and became the California governor. And then 14 years later, in 1980, Reagan won the presidency of the United States. And through it all, through his gubernatorial campaign and then into his presidential campaign in 1980, being an anti-communist and courting conservative voters that were attached to anti-communist beliefs or organizations such as the John Birch Society became a major part of the Reagan political strategy. So those are some of the politicians who capitalized on McCarthyism and used the blueprint that McCarthy gave them with and smoothed it out, perfected it, if you will, and used it to their advantage to gain higher political office and higher political heights and than Joseph McCarthy did, who never made it beyond the U.S. Senate and died sort of in infamy in 1957. So that'll wrap up our first lecture of the week, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.